Hey people, it's Nias talking now. I wanted to cover Thanksgiving, so this is a Huffington Post article called The True Story of Thanksgiving. So here it goes. The idea of the American Thanksgiving feast is a fairly recent fiction. The idyllic partnership of 17th century European pilgrims and New England Indians sharing a celebratory meal appears to be less than 120 years old. It was only after the First World War that the version of such a Puritan Indian partnership took hold in elementary schools across the American landscape. We can fact the invention of textbooks and their mass purchase by public schools were embedding this Thanksgiving image in our modern minds. It was, of course, a complete invention, a cleverly created slice of cultural propaganda, just another in a long line of inspired nationalistic myths. The first Thanksgiving Day did occur in the year 1637, but it was nothing like our Thanksgiving today. On that day, the Massachusetts colony governor John Winthrop proclaimed such a Thanksgiving to celebrate the safe return of a band of heavily armed hunters or colonial volunteers. They had just returned from their journey to what is now Mystic, Connecticut, where they massacred 700 Pequot Indians. 700 Indians, men, women, and children, all murdered. So the official day was when hundreds of people were murdered. This day is still remembered today, 373 days later. No, it's been long forgotten by white people, by European Christians, but still fresh in the minds of many Indians. A group calling themselves the United American Indians of New England meet each year at Plymouth Rock on Coles Hill for what they say is a day of mourning. They gather at the feet of a statue of Chief Massasoit of the Wampanoag to remember the long-gone Pequot. They do not call it Thanksgiving. There is no football game afterward. How then did their modern festive Thanksgiving come to be? It began with the greatest of misunderstandings, a true clash of cultural values and fundamental principles. What are we thankful for if not being here, living on this land, surviving and prospering? But in our thankfulness, might we have overlooked something? Look what happened to the original residents who lived in the area of New York we have come to call Brooklyn. A group of them called Canarsies obligingly, perhaps even eagerly, accepted various pieces of pretty colored junk from the Dutchman Peter Minuet in 1626. These trinkets have long since been estimated to have no more than 60 Dutch guilders at the time, $24 in modern American money. In exchange, the Canarsies gave Peter Minuet the island of Manhattan. What did they care? They were living in Brooklyn. Of course, all things, especially commercial transactions, need to be viewed in perspective. The nearly 24 tribes of Native Americans living in the New York area in those days had a distinctly non-European concept of territorial rights. They were strangers to the idea of real property. It was common for one tribe to grant permission to another to hunt and fish nearby themselves on a regular basis. Fences, real and imagined, were not a part of their culture. Naturally, it was polite to ask before setting up operations too close to where others lived, but refusal in matters of this sort was considered rude. As a sign of gratitude, small trinkets were usually offered by the tribe to seek temporary admission and cheerfully accepted by those already there. It was clearly understood to be a sort of short-term rental arrangement. Sad to say, the unfortunate Canarsies apparently had no idea that the Dutch meant to settle in. Worse yet for them, it must have been unthinkable that they would also be unwelcome in Manhattan after their deal. One thing we can be sure of, the equivalent of today's buyer's remorse brought the Canarsies nothing but grief, humiliation, and violence. Many Indians lived on Long Island in those days. Another Dutchman, Adrian Bloch, was the first European to come upon them in 1619. Bloch was also eager to introduce European commercialism and the Christian concept of real estate to these unfortunate innocents. Without exception, these Indians too came out of the short end in their dealings with the Dutch. The market savvy unleashed by the Europeans upon the Indians constituted the first land use policies in the New World. In the 17th century, it was not urban, but rather rural renewal. The result was, of course, the same. People of color with no money to speak of got booted out, and the neighborhood, which was subsequently gentrified and overrun by white people. Not far from Manhattan, one tribe of about 10,000 Indians lived peacefully on a lovely spot on a peninsula along the ocean. There they fished in the open seas and inland bay. They hunted across the pristine shoreline and were quite happy until they met a man, another Dutchman named William Kieft. He was the governor of New Netherland in 1639. These poor bastards were called the Rechaweag, pronounced Rockaway. Soon after meeting Governor Kieft, they became the very first New York's homeless. I just want to add in a little tidbit. You know, the Dutch who came to America, they're the same group of people who came to South Africa and became the Afrikaners, or Boers now. The people of New Netherland had a lot in common with the people of Plymouth Colony. At least it appears so from the way of both these groups of displaced and dissatisfied Europeans interacting with the local Indians. The pilgrims in Plymouth had a hard time for the first couple of years. Well, nature was no friend. Their troubles were mostly their own doing. Poor planning was their downfall. Their mostly city-dwelling Europeans failed to include among them persons with the skills needed in settling the North American wilderness. Having reached the forests and fields of Massachusetts, they turned out to be pathetic hunters and incompetent butchers. With game everywhere, they went hungry. First, they couldn't catch and kill it, then they couldn't cut it up, prepare it, preserve it, and create a storehouse for those days when fresh supplies would run low. To compensate for their shortage of essential protein, they turned to their European ways and their Christian culture. They instituted a series of religious observances. They could not hunt or farm well, but they seemed skilled at praying. They developed a taste for something both religious and useful. They called it a day of fasting. Without food, it seemed like a good idea. From necessity, that single day became multiple days. As food supplies dwindled, the day of fasting came in bunches. Each of these episodes was eventually and thankfully followed by a meal. Appropriately enough, the Puritans credited God for this good fortune. They referred to the fact that they were allowed to eat again as a Thanksgiving, and they wrote it down. First, I mentioned the word Thanksgiving. There'd be no mistake here. On that first Thanksgiving, there was no turkey, no corn, no cranberries, no stuffing, and no dessert. These fortunate pilgrims were lucky to get a piece of fish and a potato. All things considered, it was a Thanksgiving feast. Did the pilgrims share their Thanksgiving meal with the local Indians, the Wampanoag, and the Pequot? No, that never happened. That is, until its inclusion in the Thanksgiving story in 1890. Let the Wampanoag be a lesson to us, especially in these troubled economic times. These particular Indians with a bent for colorful jewelry had their tribal name altered slightly by the Dutch, who then used as a reference for all Indian payments, hence wampum. Contrary to what we've been shown in our Western movies, this word wampum and its economic meaning never made it out of New England. Unlike wampum, Thanksgiving Day has indeed spread across the continent. It would serve us well to remember that it wasn't until the victorious colonial militia returned from the slaughter of the Pequot that the new Americans began their now time-honored and cherished Thanksgiving. Enjoy your turkey. Okay, now I just want to say a couple of things. First off, as you can imagine from what you've heard, this story is quite demonic because it takes its origins, its concrete origins, from the 1637 massacre of the Pequot tribe, which commemorates hundreds of people being killed. All right? So that's why Thanksgiving should not be celebrated, because there's nothing to be thankful for. It's a day of violence, death, and murder. And as a lot of black people, most of my subscribers are black, if you believe Tariq Nasheed and a lot of other people who claim that Native Americans were here, okay, I'm not going to say yes or no. I honestly can't prove that one way or the other. But let's say that they were. So let's say that the Pequot, the Wampanoag, and all the other tribes, or a lot of them, were African people. So celebrating Thanksgiving is celebrating the slaughter of African people in America, which then paved the way for either their enslavement or for the then bringing in of slaves from Africa. So there's no reason to celebrate this, both in the general culture or for black Americans either. Anyway, I don't want to make this too long. Please comment, rate, share, and subscribe. If you want to support this channel, leave the PayPal in the description, and you can find my Instagram there. Peace, family.